I transformed cheap minis into pieces you'd be proud to display in your dollhouse. I have plenty of techniques to show you even if you don't have these particular plastic pieces. I'm making over pieces I found at the Goodwill Bins for $2 a pound. I chose this piece because of the scale and the details, knowing the color can easily be changed. I'm holding this piece while I paint it using some tacky wax at the end of a colored pencil. To help the acrylic paint stick, I sanded the plastic and mixed some white glue into the paint. I'm not painting the entire inside since the plant will hide it. To create a bit of texture for the second coat, I'm using some baking soda, Mod Podge, and paint. I'm stippling the paint to avoid brush marks and to create a stone-like texture. I chose a pretty warm color for the base because I'm adding a gray wash. I mixed up a bit of white paint, water, and black paint. When I'm creating something that looks like stone, I like to use a warm undertone or some kind of color rather than just stacking gray on gray. I think this combo creates more interest and dimension. You can fill your pot with whatever you'd like, but I'm making a mini topiary that will be easy for you to replicate. I rolled a ball of aluminum foil, poked a hole, and filled it with hot glue. I'm using this dry stick from my burn pile to make the stem of my topiary. The second aluminum ball is slightly bigger and the hole goes all the way through it. To keep things tidier, I'm hiding the hot glue inside of the aluminum ball and adding a bit to the bottom. I always keep scraps of clean aluminum foil for projects like this. I'm adding a layer of tacky glue to the top ball. White glue or wood glue would work just as well. While the glue is still wet, I'm dipping it into some flocking I got from a local hobby store. Flocking often comes in a plastic bag, but I like to store a small amount in a used shaker jar near my desk. I added glue to the bottom ball and I'm covering that as well. Most topiaries have 3 balls, but I'm going with 2. While the glue is still wet, I'm covering the topiary in rubbing alcohol to break the surface tension. I'm adding some watered down white glue in my final layer of flocking, which is this much finer, darker green color. Before I can plant my tree, I need to finish painting the base. I mixed up a wash of green paint, white paint, and some water. I'm adding this in areas moss may accumulate. I'm making a moss mixture using white glue and flocking. I impulsively added watered down white glue, but I'd skip it. I prefer mixing just the flocking and glue and using my finger to smear the thick mixture over the surface. I want this planter to look like it's been sitting outside, but I'm not going for an abandoned look. It took a lot of restraint not to add more moss since I accidentally mixed too much and I hate waste. The time has come to plant my topiary, so I added some hot glue and aluminum foil to the pot. I poked a hole in the aluminum foil and added the stem using some hot glue. I'm creating the look of dirt by covering a layer of tacky glue with some used coffee grounds from a K-cup. If you make one of these, I suggest painting the aluminum foil because I can see some of it through the flocking and it looks a bit like glitter. I nearly left this 3.5-inch long tennis racket in the bins, but I'm up for the challenge of trying to make it look like a realistic 1/12 scale miniature. The handle was pretty thick, so I'm shaving it down using my craft knife. I'll never be able to get this tennis racket completely in scale because the head of the tennis racket itself is too big. I'm hoping to get it to a point where it's passable by shaving off some of the thickness around the outside of the racket. I only removed about 1 millimeter, but you can see the difference between the left and the right. I shaved the other side and now I'm adding some length to this handle. When I trimmed the handle, I removed a holy part, so I'm making it solid again using a bit of UV resin and toothpick. Super glue would probably work well for this as well, but all of my super glue dries before I get to use it, so I try to avoid super glue. I used a lighter to burn off some fuzzy bits of plastic around the edge, and I also burned my glove. I tried sanding it, but this plastic is so cheap and soft it was just becoming fuzzy. I'm using some medical tape to keep my Frankenstein handle together and add a bit of texture. Tennis rackets tend to have some type of handle, so I'm adding some string. Once the glue dried, I used some sharp scissors to trim the string. I went to Google to get some color scheme ideas and realized tennis rackets come in a variety of very fun colors. I chose black. I'm carefully adding the color, avoiding the center mesh. Whatever this center portion is called is usually clear, but I cannot make this yellow invisible, so instead I'm painting it white. Once I added 2 coats of the white paint, I went around the edge to clean up the black. I contemplated adding silver, but instead decided to add a pop of blue. The blue paint straight from the tube was too dark, so I added a bit of white paint to lighten it. I'm using the blue I mixed up to cover all of the string details I added. I can't tell if this was a step too far, so let me know what you think of the silver handle. For a bit more realism in detail, I'm painting a logo in the center of the tennis racket. There's often a W in the middle of a tennis racket for Wilson, but instead I'm creating an M for miniature. In a strange way, I think the silver looks translucent, so I could have painted the center of the tennis racket silver and used color to add a logo. I used a toothpick to paint a small M and came back in with the original blue color to cover the edges and make it more refined. For one final detail, I'm using a white gel pen to create the look of strings around the outside of the racket. When I lit my glove on fire and filled my studio with the disgusting smell of burned latex, I questioned whether this project was worth it, but I really love it after adding the little dashes. I picked up some game pieces from the bins because I think their shape and size makes them look like miniature statues. To disguise their pressed plastic past, I'm cutting off some of the mold ridges. To help the paint stick, I'm coating them with some ultra matte sealer. You could also lightly sand your pieces or add Mod Podge or white glue to your paint. Now the pieces will get 2 separate treatments, starting with this horse statue. I want both of the statues to look like metal, so I'm starting by giving the horse statue a bluish-green base coat of paint. I'm lightly dry brushing some gold paint to make this look like aged copper. This looks really good as it is, so you could stop at this step, but I have one more trick up my sleeve. To really sell this little statue as a piece of aged copper, I'm covering the entire thing with a wash. I mixed a thin paint wash using some white paint and water. I want the pigments to remain, so I'm applying it liberally so it looks good when it dries. I'd really love to use this technique on a miniature weather vane to make it look like aged copper. I'm transforming this miniature cannon into a bronze statue using some gold rub and buff. I had a bit of a mishap while mixing the paint by squeezing the tube, so pardon my gilded fingers. I'm using some Panaline accent color to create more depth, but you could use watered down paint. You can make your acrylic washes flow more easily by adding a drop of dish soap. This piece from the game Risk would look great on a miniature bookshelf. I'm transforming this plastic teapot into a silver vase filled with flowers. To prepare for paint, I sanded all of the flat surfaces and gave it a coat of ultra matte sealer. I'm using silver leaf rub and buff to add some color. I really love the coverage and luster of rub and buff, but you could also use acrylic paint instead. I'm emphasizing the floral detail using a simple wash of acrylic paint and water. I like to add too much since it dries really subtle. I'm using some moss and greenery I found at the bins to make a flower arrangement. I'm snipping just the ends of these branches using some flesh cutters I also got at the bins. These plastic stems are covered in green and purple styrofoam balls. I'm hoping it gives the impression of lilac or hydrangea. I'm using the moss to fill in empty spaces and add greenery and texture. I was initially using hot glue to add the clusters, but switched to white glue. I wanted to quickly form the basis of the floral arrangement, but use a tidier glue to finish it up. I got these faux miniature cracked eggs in a recent Temu haul. I didn't realize how thick and out of scale they are, especially since I mostly work in 1/12. I admit I am cheating a bit, and instead of turning these into a dollhouse miniature, I'm just converting them into earrings. For my first step, I drilled a hole in each of the eggs in approximately the same spot. I bought the solid silver jump rings and earring hooks from Goodwill Buy the Pound. Since you pay by the pound, I paid less than 1 cent for 35 grams of silver. I felt like a clever person coming up with this idea, but then I googled it and other people have made these exact earrings. Consider joining my Patreon as a free member or as a paying member for $3 a month. Do let me know which of these projects is your favorite and make sure to watch this video next.